agree, Lillian. I think Jane Eyre is a way for Bronte to hold a mirror up to society and up to ourselves. And she asks you to look at it and see what you see and then interpret that. And I think it's a very powerful thing that she's done in this book.
What about Jane Eyre is unique over all other stories that I've read? Or similar to the ones that are truly great, right? It's the ones that create a situation where there is no clear way out of this. Yeah. And the choices are all good and all bad. And you just have to make the one that is right for you and the situation that you're in.
Lillian, it's been a year?
It's been a year.
Yay!
Yay!
Picture all the little Muppets waving their little felt arms in the air, because that's our audience that we have here today.
Oh, and we love you. We love you all so much.
Yeah. Hooray. How you feeling?
I'm feeling fantastic. I'm feeling very excited. We have accidentally become pretty notorious for our accidentally incredibly long episodes. And we've both talked about our concern/excitement that this might be a very long boy given our topic today. So I almost feel like jumping right on in.
Let's do it. Yeah, no need to waste time. So we are here to discuss why Jane Eyre, and that is another way of saying, why has this story persisted for as long as it has? How has it had so many adaptations? Why does it continue to speak to an audience, even though the audience has significantly changed and grown since like the story originally was written? So we're here to kind of break that down today and kind of see if we can come up with an answer.
Yeah, this is an episode that you and I have been talking about for a while, because it's the question I've asked myself most frequently over the last year. There are so many adaptions of this movie. It is or this story. It is just wild to me. So here's some fun facts. I have some fun facts about, obviously, guys, Lillian's coming with fun facts. It's the 1-year anniversary. It'd be wild if I didn't come with fun facts.
Seriously. Fun fact, Lillian loves fun facts.
The first fun fact is mostly for Piper, honestly. So awesome. We're recording this a bit early because we have some grand plans for how we're going to roll this out to you guys that may or may not happen. We're recording this in December, and I was like, well, when we recorded our first episode of Eyre Buds quite a while before we actually started releasing episodes. So this episode is coming out exactly 1 year after we released our first episode, which is funny because we released our first episode on a Sunday and then started doing them Mondays. Only I find that fun, but I don't care.
Ooh, yay, little changes.
This is also 1 year, almost exactly, since we recorded the first episode that we're recording this.
Aww.
Just a little fun fact for you.
So we recently recorded a holiday palette cleanser, and we've been talking a lot about tradition and the way that we feel this time of year. I am feeling like kind of nostalgic of being like, like this time last year, Lillian agreed to watch something that she hates and then dedicate her life to it. And she didn't read the fine print at the time, but I did say, I now own your soul forever, and you will do this until you die. And so here we are, 1 year into the contract.
Here's the thing. You made me sign that contract, but I'm the one enforcing it, baby.
I know you really are. I've many times been like holding a match under the contract. I'm like, I can release you. And you're like, don't you dare.
But I think that's part of it too, right? Like I've been asking myself, you go listen to those first couple episodes. We've talked about this a lot. I did not like this story. You watched the Timothy Dalton version because you like Timothy Dalton, and then started watching all of these adaptions because what the hell is this story?
Right.
So what, and we fell in love with it. Like this last year of episodes, you can listen to us go from like one person who kind of likes it, but is like, doesn't have a lot of insight, or not insight. You always had great insights, but like just that depth of understanding that we have now. And one person who truly dislikes this story to two people who are like obsessed with it. Like it's so incredible. And my question is like, when I looked up lists, I tried to find, cause I'm like, we can't be the only people who want to know how many adaptions of things have existed. So I found all these lists of like most adapted pieces of whatever, and they're very incomplete because some of the most adapted things are Christmas Carol is number one on most lists.
I was going to guess that.
Then it becomes like the works of Shakespeare. Like they don't break it out by each one. Same thing with Jane Austen is another one that's like wildly adapted frequently. But when it comes to like a singular piece of work, Jane Eyre is on those lists. It is almost impossible, unless I have done like hours of looking for this to figure out how many adaptations of Jane Eyre there are. This is the fun facts, the other fun facts that I brought, which is there are, hold on, I forgot to write the total on my notes like a dummy.
I will fill in actually while Lillian looks for some stats and say that one thing that I was thinking about kind of in relation to that is I'm like, is it, because I was trying to think of like other period stories, like period drama stories that maybe have persisted as much. And whereas I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is like a Pride and Prejudice, which is insanely popular and I think has a much more broad public appeal than a Jane Eyre does. There have been like some TV and film adaptations, but nothing even remotely close to like Jane Eyre being adapted. And I was kind of wondering, I'm like, why though? Because they're both costume dramas. They're both like fun, compelling stories. But I wonder if it's partially because it's easy to keep doing a Jane Eyre because you can do it with a minimal cast, whereas like a Pride and Prejudice or something has like this giant family and all of these players. All you really need is Thornfield. You can allude to other things. And so like you can just simply, like some of the TV adaptations we've seen where it's like, oh, it's just like a black box and they put up some cardboard cutouts to make it look like a fireplace. You can kind of do this in a lot of creative and minimal ways, which I think also makes it very easy and approachable for people who want to do a production of something.
Yeah. And I think it is one of those things where genuinely, I think you're right. I think there have been more adaptations of Jane Eyre than Pride and Prejudice. There's more adaptations though of Jane Austen than of Jane Eyre, that's like, it's an apples and oranges situation.
You can't do that comparison.
Well, and it's just tough because it's like, if you want to do something like Pride and Prejudice, you could choose to do Emma, you could choose to do Sense and Sensibility, you could choose, but like, what is it about this one story of Jane Eyre that makes it so unbelievably compelling? So I'm certain that the list I have is incomplete. And one of the reasons for that is the Wikipedia list, which is the first thing I started going off of when I was looking for some of those more obscure adaptions. They have a whole Wikipedia page that's all Jane Eyre adaptions. Unfortunately, when I went to go through it for this episode, I realized that I know of a bunch of adaptions of Jane Eyre that are not on that list.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start editing the Wikipedia page now, guys. But to give us a rough idea of how many adaptions of Jane Eyre there are, there's a total, not including books, because Jane Eyre has also inspired a ton of books. There are 73 adaptions. So there's 24 movies, 8 silent movies, 16 sound movies. There are 14 radio adaptions. That is one that I know there's at least twice that many. There are 17 TV adaptions, whether that's TV shows, skits, or TV movies, and 18 theater adaptions. The earliest of all of these adaptions on the list is from 1849, which means within 2 years of the publication of this book, there was an adaptation of it as a play.
And when you say theater, I mean, that is mostly just going off of like big, like significant theaters, because I'm sure there's been many more like small theater productions.
Well, and it's, do they write their own script and all this stuff?
Right. Yeah.
There's that list, like I said, deeply incomplete because I know of other ones. So like, so much of this too is like, did a local community theater take this in 1848 and just like put something on and records haven't survived from that? Like, we don't know.
Cute. The community players are doing Jane Eyre, a new hit beloved by Queen Victoria.
But some stats that I am fairly certain about. So that's just to give people an idea. There's 73 documented on the list versions of it. We have watched in this last year 26 of them. which
Nice.
as a percentage, very high. That comes out to the runtime totals of all of those together. It's about 2,838 minutes or 47.3 hours.
Yay!
Which means if we didn't sleep for 2 days, we could just watch everything straight through.
Really? Even with the giant YouTube version?
Yes.
That would be a whole day in itself, right?
It'd be 8 hours. So if we don't sleep, if we did it in a reasonable way where we only did 12 hours a day so we could have bathroom breaks and naps, it would probably take us 4 or 5 days to get through all of these.
That's incredible.
Is just wild.
And guys, we've dedicated those hours of our lives to you partially. You get to like enjoy everything that came from it. So you're welcome.
We love you.
Yeah.
This is the last of my fun facts. And then I swear we'll go into the rest of the episode. But this is something that I am once again going to show Piper. But if you watch on YouTube or hopefully at this point on our Patreon, you will also get to see this. Here is a timeline that I'm still cleaning up of all of the adaptations we have watched of Jane Eyre. Very cool. Starting, our very first one was the 1934 version, or like not our very first one we watched, but that's the oldest one we've watched, which was the first movie with sound. And then the most recent adaptation or kind of Jane Eyre inspired piece that we've had was Reluctant Immortals, which came out this past year in 2022, when we got to talk to Gwendolyn about her lovely novel. But from 1930 to 2020 to the 2020s, there has only been one decade that we haven't watched something from, which is the 60s, because they're all incredibly hard to find.
Interesting. And are those where some of the foreign films are as well?
No, because if while there are films from the 60s, there are TV shows from the 60s. It's not that they're hard to find, and they're hard to find in English.
Okay. Cool.
So there's a couple of reasons why we haven't watched any in there, but hopefully in the future we will. But some of them you have to travel for because they live on physical film and they won't digitize it just for our podcast for some reason. So rude.
So rude. We will change that.
But
this is cool to see. Yeah, everything laid out and kind of it kind of gives you a visual of what points in time did people say, let's just keep remaking this. So that's interesting.
Yeah. And I also think it's so this is a little bit more heavily weighted like from the 70s on. And part of that is those are just more easy to access. It gets harder to access, particularly the more obscure versions that we love so very much when you go further back than that. But this will be on your screen if you're watching this on YouTube or on Patreon. But I mostly made this for my own brain to be able to kind of visualize so Jane Eyre has been around for 175 years. We have watched just shy of 100 years of adaptions.
Very cool.
Which is really, it's kind of wild. But do you want to explain, Piper, to our lovely listeners how we're going to talk about answering the question? This is the what of Jane Eyre, and we're going to go into the why of Jane Eyre.
Yes. So we were sort of discussing, as is wise when it comes to us and Jane Eyre topics.
Because otherwise it'll be days.
Yes, we will spend 2 days talking about this without sleeping or breathing. So we created an outline to kind of guide our talking points. And I think one of the things that we're going to start with is one of the most powerful elements of Jane Eyre is the themes of the story that have persisted and relate with readers throughout time. So we've narrowed it down to 3 main themes. There are obviously way more than that, but we're going to be talking about a few themes to begin with. We're then kind of going to go into discussing characters, how Charlotte Bronte writes these characters, how that makes reading it so compelling. And then we'll kind of wrap up by talking about, how do you interpret all of these things and what makes it so great for interpretation, adaptation, and how it can persist. So this is just sort of what we will be doing today. But do you want to, Lillian, kind of lead us in to this discussion of theme?
Yeah. So the themes of Jane Eyre is something we've discussed a few times. It's something we've actually asked our listeners about before. And we had some great responses from that as well. But like you said, we tried to connect some of our favorite things we wanted to talk about together. And we also have a couple of things that we are explicitly putting to the side. So we love the theme of like nature and humanity and that sort of stuff. We're going to put that to the side because that is going to be its own discussion. That's going to be its own separate thing. And while it absolutely influences some of these other things and will probably be discussed in there, it's just a little bit different than what we're doing today. Another one that I do actually think is probably one of the key elements of why Jane Eyre that we just literally could not possibly cover today is faith and religion. It's something we've talked about in a few episodes that we are working towards creating an episode specifically on that. We got a couple ways that we're going to approach that, but that is another one where we're going to kind of set that to the side. It might come up in some of these other discussions, but that is not something we're going to go into a great deal of detail on today. What we are going to go into detail on are three pretty big areas. One is the idea of female strength. Mm-hmm. So the feminism of Jane Eyre, what is female strength? How is it highlighted? Why is this a special way to look at that? Mm-hmm. Talking about defining morality. So Jane Eyre has a lot of discussions about right and wrong and what makes a good person. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. And then finally, we're going to talk about the different relationships of Jane Eyre. And we have a lot of ways we're going to look at that. And that's probably the one we've talked about the most of these. But I'm pretty excited to go through all of these. And I'm curious as to your first thoughts on these themes or one in particular.
Yeah. So since we're starting with female strength. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think is so interesting, Lillian, about, I think, witnessing your progression of going from tolerating Jane Eyre to loving Jane Eyre is, I think, when and this is partially by me choosing maybe not the greatest version to introduce you to this story, but I think when we started it, the version of Jane Eyre that we watched, the 80s version, I don't think it portrayed the kind of feminine strength that you like to see in a Jane. And I don't think it was until we got to like Mia in 2011 when you started to see some feminist things that you as a modern audience relate to. So I think one thing that's so interesting is feminism is a term that it means something to different people, of course. I think when I was younger, before I started looking into it, to me, it always kind of seemed almost like I heard it used in negative contexts of people kind of being like, oh, well, this is just like pushing an agenda and blah, blah, blah. And it hasn't been until I'm I'm older and I've looked into more things where I'm like, no, it's not about women over men. It's about equality. And so it's something I think is really interesting as a book with a female protagonist who is also our narrator and our perspective character. She leads us through this world and we see things through her lens. And I think that automatically tells us that we need to come at this from a feminist perspective. I mean, all things we should. But so I think that's one thing that I'm very excited to hear you kind of talk about, is because I think you have a bit more thoughts on that maybe than I normally do when I'm consuming my media. I think you're kind of always looking for that thing, and I'm kind of it's in the side for me. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that in Jane Eyre.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned how you used to think about feminism versus how you understand it today. And I just think about I know which discussions you felt like we were pushing an agenda. I was the one out there being like, we should maybe burn the world to the ground because of how women are treated.
And I'm like, but I just want to watch a couple kiss. Is that so bad?
I think the kissing is fun. Does that mean I don't like ladies? I just hate all women? Because
I'm like, no, I think I like ladies, though. I am one.
I am one, and I don't want to be controlled by men, but also it's kind of cute when they do it. So I think it's interesting that you explicitly said a modern audience, because I think so much of this discussion is, why is Jane Eyre so timeless? And I think we've talked a lot about how throughout these different adaptions, it's been interpreted a little bit differently, and people have put that contemporary lens of femininity on it. We talked about that particularly in the 94 radio adaptation. Jane was starting a small business because she's such a girl boss. It just was a particular flavor of feminism. But I think the feminism in Jane Eyre is so timeless because it is that fundamental idea that you talked about that is the center of feminism, which is just the idea that women are men and men are equal. Like they, and that is a key, the most feminist kind of, I want to call it a monologue, but passage of Jane Eyre is that moment when she's saying that women have just as much of an internal life as men. And this is a woman's internal life and a level of depth and complexity that I don't know that there's a better version. Even if it wasn't necessarily the first, I think there's lots of arguments to be made. There's other versions of it. I think it's one of the best I've ever seen, like in anything. And it captures the true complexity. And it also, the other big thing that I think is really relevant in that, because I think you touched on that idea of like, we're seeing it from this woman's perspective. It's this complex story and she's having a complex life. I also think she doesn't narrow down what a woman can be and what that feminine strength can be. Because Jane goes through a lot of different phases of what strength is and what her strength looks like. But there's also a ton of other women who are in a ton of situations, and none of them are, some of them are right, are like right, good people. Some of them are wrong, bad people, but it's none of them are that simple. Like Miss Temple and Helen are wonderful and almost holy in some ways, and yet imperfect. Mrs. Reed and Blanche Ingram and Miss Scatcherd are evil in some ways, and yet complex and sympathetic, and we can understand them. And I think that is the breadth of female strength that we see, and the breadth of female life is something that still today I struggle with in representation when I watch media of like, this is what a woman should be. And Jane Eyre has always been a contradiction to that. And I think that's one of the really key pieces of it as well.
Oh, totally. I completely agree. I think it's interesting too. It occurred to me that when Charlotte Bronte wrote and published this, she, like many female authors, did it under a male pseudonym, and yet still it is titled The Autobiography of Jane Eyre, and it is being released under this male author's name and then otherwise told first person through this female lens. And I think it must have been, there's so many instances where I'm like, I wish I had a time machine so I could be a fly on the wall for this moment, because I would love to know, is that one of the reasons why this blew people away when it came out, is because there wasn't a lot of literature that was giving that female perspective and that female voice at the time? Like maybe there were, but people just weren't talking about it. But this, I think that's one way that it made a big impact, is that, yes, we get these beautiful monologues of Jane, like her inner thoughts, thinking about, her equality, her rights, her strength, her dreams and aspirations. And I wonder, it's interesting that Bronte had to kind of maybe first come out with that under this like pseudonym. And I wonder also, maybe we'll learn about this when we watch the documentary, at what point, because I know there are several versions of this that have come out, like when she had done like revisions, and I wonder at which point she dropped the nom de plume and was like, it's me, Charlotte Bronte, this is my book, or did that not happen until after she passed away? I'm very curious about that.
I actually saw a thing about this, and I'm sure it'll go into it in the documentary, but she did at one point come out to her publisher as the author. And so that was because they had previously only corresponded via letters, which was how she told them she was a man. But yeah, I think that's such a great point, because I think when you think about just that idea, right? Like where women were at that time and what was considered acceptable for women and the kinds of things that would have been considered controversial. Like, I don't think, and if I said to someone right now out loud, women have just as much of an internal life as men, I don't know anyone who would argue that that's not true. There's a lot, but in some ways that's still part of the conversation that's being had. Like when you watch like deeply sexist boy bosses with podcasts, like that's what they're talking about a lot. But like, I think it's so interesting that there is still this core conversation about what it is like to be a woman. There's something that still resonates in Jane Eyre for me. And I think you touched on that when we were doing our last book episode in a way that really clarified something for me, where it's, what does strength mean? Like, we're talking, that's I think such an incredible theme. And that's why we did feminine strength and not just feminism and not just what it is to be a woman, but what is female strength? What does that look like? And I think it absolutely can be women having this like hands on your hips, breaking a vase, like just physically strong or like towing that line. But there's another layer of that, of a different type of strength that I did not recognize when I first watched this, because it's really hard to capture in the adaptions. I think we've talked about a couple of adaptions where we've seen it. In the 2011 is a great example of that. I think the 73 does it to an extent as well. I could go on, but it's hard to capture the strength of vulnerability.
Yes.
Which was something you explicitly called out in our last book episode. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember the exact kind of moments, because I feel like when I was speaking about the strength to be vulnerable, I think I was also mentioning moments where Rochester shows us that. But I think the vulnerability that we see in Jane comes in at the end of, holding back her feelings for so long, as this man kind of like pokes and prods at her in what I assume he thinks is a fun way, not realizing he's breaking her heart, until she finally kind of snaps and says, no, this is everything I'm feeling. And I need you to know this about me, because this here in this moment when I am exposing my heart to you, this is when we are equals. And it's a scene that, as I think we're going to talk about many times today, you can interpret in so many beautiful ways, because you can do that scene like the National Theater production, which is a bit more kind of like they're both sort of like shouting at each other to like express the depth of those passions. But you can also play that scene in a very soft and gentle way of, this is a quiet suffering. And that can also be insanely impactful. That kind of moment when it's scarier. You'd rather have your parents shout at you than have them stand there and say quietly, I'm disappointed, because that will kill me. And I'm like, God, don't say that, please. There's different weights. And I love that people can read these passages and then do something different. And they're both awesome.
Yeah. And I think to your point with that idea of the way that strength comes out in different moments and can be interpreted and all of that stuff, it reminds me of something that, again, is really hard to capture in adaptations, is something that a lot of our listeners bring up. And it actually was something specifically Charlene had mentioned on the episode I did with her, which is the idea that Jane is somewhat introverted, which is something that I think still today we mistake somebody being extroverted as someone being strong, like somebody who just like is louder and talks more, like knocks things over and just like dominates in meetings, and like me can't stop talking for some reason. As that person is smarter, that person is like whatever, like all of those things. Stronger is often one of those words. I think that introverted strength is another one, where it's like in those moments when Jane is leaving Rochester, I think that's a moment where we see that softer, quieter internal strength so much in her, because we see it interpreted in so many adaptions as him standing and yelling at her. And there's, again, we'll talk about this, so many ways to look at that scene. And it's just her quietly and internally knowing that she knows what the right thing is. She has this internal compass of right and wrong, and she's going to follow that. And she has the strength to stick with that kind of regardless.
Yeah, I think one thing, and we're going to go into this more when we start discussing like character and how Bronte writes these characters. But I think that's one of the things about Jane that makes her such a great protagonist is I think she's very inspirational. I think she is an example of someone, yes, who can like stick to their morals, who can walk away and to like preserve their self-respect. And I think there's lots of things about Jane's character that many readers and viewers can see and be like, I want to be that. Like, I want to, not give in to, my immediate instant gratification temptations to like smooch this guy if I know it's only going to crash and burn later on. But I think one more thing about strength that I want to say is one element that I love so much about Jane in her story is how we see her grow. I think character development is one of the most important things. I do not care for a character who doesn't change or learn something. If they kind of stay the same, I'm like, okay, like, sure, whatever. But it's way more interesting when you get to see how far they've come, because I love Jane's initial strength is more of that, I'm going to punch my cousin in the face, because
which we love.
Yes, we do. I love it. I freaking love a Spitfire little girl Jane. And I also love how I feel like she doesn't discard or throw away that like fire. It just it morphs into something else as she gets older, because I think you could argue, you're like, oh no, like society tempered her and now she's like this polite girl who'll just sit there and take it. And it's like, no, she's still feeling everything little Jane felt, and she's still like, processing these emotions, but now she can, I don't know, she's honed it into a tool that she can now use like when she really needs to. Like when she has that line, she's like, I am a free person with a free will, which I now I exert to leave you. And like just the way that she has gone from that little kid to now this incredible woman, I think is great to see.
Yeah. And I think it's similar to the idea of like, again, the narrow view within which we view strength versus the realities of what strength is. Like so often, and this is something that, again, it's hard to do in adaptions that we see in the book, which is strength can look like not saying something. Strength can be standing there quietly and going, I am furious and jealous and upset in this moment, but I'm not going, because I know the consequences of this will be this, this, and this. I'm going to stay quiet. And I think that is a type of strength that is not unique to women, but I think is captured in Jane Eyre in a way that is still so true for women. Because again, that theme of why does this keep ringing true? Why is this something that we keep looking at and interpreting in these ways? I think the moments of like that feeling of why does the line, I am not a bird, no net ensnares me. That feeling of I am trapped.
Yeah.
And I can't do things, and you're holding me in, and I'm in this net, and you get to decide what my life is, versus the feeling that is expressed in that moment of that is a lie that society is telling me. And I am my own person and I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
That is, I think it's in some ways a universal experience, but I think women, and honestly, any group who has any level of oppression has experienced a lot as well. I think that is in so many ways a universal feeling of breaking free of the constraints that exist in our minds because of society. And it's so hard to capture and express in a way that feels real. And I think that's something I have dealt with in my life at many different points, particularly in the last year. There's specific examples that I know you know about that I'm thinking of that are like, we can't possibly go into right now. But like, I think that's very true. And we could, again, do a whole episode on this. But I think that leads into defining morality. But I want to make sure, is there anything else before we go into that you want to talk about with female strength?
Just that I think the way you articulated your interpretation of that line, Lillian, is very beautiful. And as you were saying it, I was also connecting to that in a way that I hadn't really before. I think there's a lot of things, like you say, that are so hard even nowadays to like say this out loud and have someone take you seriously because they're like, oh, well, everything's equal now, right? And you're like, but actually it's not though. Like, and there's like a million things to go into that, but I just love the way you phrased that. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yay.
Okay, so yes, defining morality. This one I think is kind of at the heart of Jane Eyre for me anyway. I was kind of breaking up different ways to answer this why Jane Eyre question in my own notes. And I talked about like the writing is so beautiful. It pulls you in. The characters are so compelling. You know these people. But then I said the story in itself and the impact of that twist, I think, because for me, that will always be, if you know, you've listened to episode 1 and you've seen my intro of the kind of how did we get here situation.
Yeah.
It was literally like the rug had been pulled out from under my feet because that story went from being like an odd romance to suddenly it's like, oh, you didn't realize this was a TED Talk on morality? Well, buckle up. And it's like, oh, fuck, I'm not ready. And it just like, it slaps you in the face and it's like, let's look at how you see the world and we're going to have this intense conversation. And it's like, holy crap. So I think talking about morality, that's like, I think that's the heart of this story.
Well, and I think something that, so we have a couple of bullets that we even put within this of the idea of like right versus wrong. What makes a good person, personal morals versus societal morals. And I think all of those are things that are discussed. But as I'm thinking about, like you said, that idea of like, you have that twist of Bertha being locked in the attic. One of the great moral questions of Jane Eyre that we've talked about Bertha in a whole episode. We did that character study on her. So we know all the nuances of that question. And it's a question, what makes a good and bad person? What is the right thing to do? What is the wrong thing to do is woven into this whole story. And especially once you have your eyes open to it, it's like, wow. But I think that that's something that's discussed in a lot of other books, right? That's something that's discussed in a lot of other places. So why does Jane Eyre, what is the conversation in Jane Eyre that makes it so special? And I think there's a couple of different things to it. Like you said, it's wrapped up in this interesting story. And so it's not some religious figure standing on a pulpit dictating to you what the answers to those questions are. But I think more interesting to me is I don't know that she is answering those questions as much as she's asking them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think Charlotte, because in discussing the final chapters of the book, we both said we're like, we don't actually have like a concrete, like, we did it, we solved this book. There is no like easy solution. I agree, Lillian. I think Jane Eyre is a way for Bronte to hold a mirror up to society and up to ourselves. And she asks you to look at it and see what you see and then interpret that. And I think it's a very powerful thing that she's done in this book.
And I think it's also interesting because when you look at the characters that like, we'll talk about this when we talk about the characters. I don't think they fall as cleanly into these buckets as some of the adaptions make them look. And I also don't think they fall as cleanly into these buckets as we often talk about it, not just in fiction, but in life. We put people in like, you are a good person, you are a bad person. And in doing a bad thing, all of the good that you've done has washed away. And in doing a good thing, all of the bad you have done is washed away. And I don't think that's true. But when we look at the characters that we like or don't like, or the clear villains, the clear heroes of Jane Eyre, setting aside that complexity for a moment, some of our villains, Mrs. Reed, Brocklehurst, St. John, those three characters have one big thing in common. They are sure they are right. They know what the right thing is. They fit within society's expectations of that. And they are following the doctrine of an existing set of rules. The characters that are lovely and wonderful and hold our whole hearts are Miss Temple, Helen. I think even you look at St. John's sisters, maybe like Jane herself. Those are characters who don't have that certainty, at least for other people. Even Rochester is asking questions and is questioning what it is that society is telling him what to do. And if I were to say she's making a point, I think the part of her point is, don't just believe the things that are told to you. Don't just trust that the rules are right, because that's not going to lead you to doing good for the right reasons, for the right people, and or for yourself. You have to, that has to be something that comes from inside, not from outside of you.
Yeah. I think you're making me think about how before in our last section I talked about we get to see Jane evolve from like girl to woman and see her grow that way. We also get to see her develop her sense of morals as she gets older. We see the influences that life has dealt her this unhappy hand, and she received so much cruelty and distance from other people. And yet, because she had like little bits of help from like Helen and Miss Temple and things like that, she was able to form this very strong sense of morals and how she was going to go into the world and try and do her best and try to, you know, keep going and be there for other people. And I think it's so interesting that when it comes to, I think if you almost view this story as like two roads coming together. One is Jane on her road, and then one is Rochester on his. We are entirely with Jane, watching her develop all of these like morals and life lessons and ways that she sees the world and the ways that she's going to govern her actions. And then once we meet at that moment where Rochester has to like explain, whereas we've seen Jane grow, Rochester has 5 minutes to explain his entire journey, and he's also emotionally distraught and afraid that he's going to lose the woman he loves. And so I just think that's so interesting that like from viewing someone go through that to then just simply hearing someone frantically tell you, this is what happened to me. This is why I made these choices. This is how I see the world. I've now laid everything at your feet. Please, 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 please stay with me. It's so interesting, right? I don't know. I think that's one of the powerful things about this too.
For sure. And like you talking about that path that Jane is on makes me think about those big moments of questioning that Jane has throughout the book of what's right and wrong are so often her moving onto her own path. So the moment we talked about this a lot in our very first episode of the book, where the book starts on that rainy day when there was no chance they were going to go on a walk is a moment of questioning morality and changing the path that she is on. Because up until that moment, she has done what kids do, which is somebody tells you what the right thing is and how to be in the world, and you follow that. And it has not been going great for Jane.
Yeah.
She's been trying to be good. She's been trying to do what's right and has never gotten the things she wants to out of it. And when she starts to question that and gets hit in the face with a book and goes, actually, screw you, and hits him right back.
Yes.
That's when she starts to break free and start going down her own path. That's like that key first moment. And then we get another big questioning of morality of Jane talking with Helen about, if people hate me, I can't do it. I'll have to compromise my morals to be loved. And Helen's response of, no, you'll be loved by God and yourself, and that's what matters. And watching Jane evolve, because in that moment, she doesn't just go, well, Helen is great, and Helen said that. So like, that's part of what I think is so impactful about the story as well, is the changes we see and the way she makes these changes are the way they happen in life. Jane isn't suddenly a different person after she punches her cousin in the face.
Right.
Like, that's not that's part of her origin story, but she goes back to trying to be good. We spend months with her at Gateshead trying to sort through that. And that leads to her conversation with Aunt Reed, where she stands her ground and says, actually, you suck.
Yeah. I'm not a liar, because if I was, I would say, I love you, savage Jane. I love that line.
And we see those same, anytime she is faced with a moral dilemma, we get to see and experience her logic of that. And what is so interesting to me in that growth is I don't think it reminds me a little bit of the something I think about a lot is Michelle Obama's book is called Becoming. And it's all about the idea. It's still an action verb. It's not about her becoming first lady. Like, that's not what this book is. It's about her becoming a person and continuing to be like the idea that we are continuing to become who we are, and that is an ongoing process that we are all a part of. I think that it is really hard because you're trying to create a satisfying arc in a story to represent a character that is not done at any point. Like she has her happily ever after with Rochester. She has that beautiful moment. But Jane, when she's fighting John Reed, Jane, when she is talking to Miss Temple, Jane, when she's meeting Rochester, Jane, when she's leaving Rochester, Jane, when she is talking to St. John, Jane, when she returns to Rochester, all of those versions of her are real and true to who she is. And she's growing and changing, but it doesn't diminish the previous version of her, which is incredible.
I know. And I think one note that I made about this, because just of like little things that we've kind of gathered along the way of knowing about Charlotte Bronte and the influences in her life, is I think there's so much. I love that the original title of this is Jane Eyre, like an autobiography, because I think there is so much of Charlotte and her existence and her experiences that's in Jane. And so I'm, again, probably save a lot of that for when we actually watch the documentaries and stuff. But a good author draws from real life and is able to articulate that on the page, while, you're right, still forming a compelling and consecutive story that we all like want to listen to. Another thing that I kind of want to chat about, because you talked about, you know, this continual growth. I feel like that's one thing I think we can agree our favorite moment is when Rochester is kind of, you know, opening up for the first time, right? Of his vulnerability. And
a favorite moment for sure.
Okay. A favorite moment. So I think because he is someone who up until that point, I think has believed that he's figured it all out. And that moment is him realizing, just as you say, like, oh, I guess I don't know everything. I don't have this all under control. And when, you know, after Jane leaves him, he now also has to adapt and change from that moment. I also want to say that in discussing morality, right, of like, you know, oh, this person did a bad thing, they're a bad person. I find myself, whenever I think about that, about like in like the real world, when there are people out there doing bad things, it's hard for me to ever just simply fall back on that and be like, that's a bad person. Because I always want to think to myself, I'm like, what were the circumstances that brought this person to this point? And I think that's something that we really see in Rochester, and where as we go through our own lives and we know our own experiences, it's hard to put yourself into someone else's shoes to say, but why are they acting this way? What are the influences that made them come to this choice? And so for, like I kind of touched already, of Rochester in that moment, having to suddenly lay his life story on the table, most people don't even get that chance, right? And so I just think it's such an interesting moment of saying kind of like, well, you know, you have to take this person for their word. But if, you know, we do with every other fellow human being on this earth, I think it's our responsibility when making these judgments to say, what have you gone through before this moment that led you to this? And can I sympathize with that?
For sure. And I think it's so similar to the thing I said at the beginning, which is she's asking questions. And I think that same moment with Rochester, what got you to this point? I think it's also not clearly good, right? Like, there's this interesting dynamic, especially when you get online, especially with social media, of like, things are good or bad. They are black and white. There's the right thing and there's the wrong thing. And I think someone like St. John, very certain of the right and wrong thing. Someone like Brocklehurst, very certain of the right or wrong thing. Characters that are terrible and I hate them. They're so well done and I hate them so much. And I think looking at Rochester, it would be really easy to dismiss all of his actions as wrong. But it would also be really easy. It is in some ways really easy to take it to the other extreme and go, well, he was hurting and Bertha was abusive to him and he had no choices and he loved Jane and he was trying not to put her in a position. Like, Rochester is a morally gray character. Inherently, there is nothing about him that is clean and clear one way or the other. He is simultaneously, every choice he made, there's no good answer. Bronte created a situation where there's no easy way to solve it, which is how life is. And I think that in some ways, what about Jane Eyre is unique over all other stories that I've read, or similar to the ones that are truly great, right? It's the ones that create a situation where there is no clear way out of this. And the choices are all good and all bad. And you just have to make the one that is right for you and the situation that you're in. It is objectively horrendous that a woman was locked in an attic and hidden away from everyone, torn away from the people that she knows and loves. That is objectively horrendous. And yet, Rochester was doing his absolute best to do right by her.
Yeah. And I think it's the thing that, like, if I was at a party and I'm like, so Jane Eyre, and someone's like, what's that story about? And I'm like, well, it's a man who tries to commit bigamy, but you're rooting for him. And you're like, what? And it's like, no, but you have to get into these nitty gritty details. But that's, I think, part of the why Jane Eyre, because that's the surface level and it's the tip of the iceberg. It's the giant, like, amazing depth of intrigue and discussion and all that's underneath that it's like, whoa.
It's the reason why I don't mention too many. Like, I talk about the fact that I have a podcast a lot, but I can't casually mention, oh, I have a podcast about Jane Eyre, because inevitably it turns into me being like, no, what you don't understand. And then people, which happens to people around me often, are trapped in a hours-long conversation about something they did not sign up for.
But hopefully in the end, they've walked away learning something, and maybe they're going to go check out Jane Eyre.
And maybe that they've learned to go check out Jane Eyre, and maybe they've learned to not talk to me anymore.
Like, well, my choice after this discussion is never to speak to Lillian again.
I can't casually talk to Lillian about anything. And I'm like, no, just this list of things I care a lot about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that leads to me, because again, we could talk about just that for an hour, into thinking about the relationships of Jane Eyre. And I'm curious, do you have more on the morality, or are we ready to talk about relationships?
I think we're ready to talk about relationships. And this is one that you and I, like you said, we discussed this the most off air, because when we were trying to brainstorm themes, I'm like, relationships isn't a theme, but like, I'm like trying to articulate exactly what I mean by this. And I think for me, the way I'm going to approach talking about this section is, because again, I've focused so much this episode about like Jane's journey. And I think one thing that is also so compelling about this story is the fact that Jane begins without community. And I think most of her motivation that's moving her forward is her quest for companionship and community and fellowship with other human beings. Because I think she begins feeling very wretched and alone, because that's how her family made her feel. The one kind person at Gateshead was a maid who hardly had enough time to even care for her a little. So like sometimes she was kind and caring, but sometimes she was busy and she was just almost as cruel as the family. And so Jane became, I think, constantly searching for others in her life. And so I think that's why I'm focusing so much on like, what are these pockets of communities? What are these types of relationships that she's formed? But then for me too, as we said, when we were discussing chapter 27 and then the following chapters, is I think so much of Jane's growth happens when she then also simultaneously experiences her independence and finds herself. So for me, it will be this discussion of the relationships that we form and how they influence us, but then also how does the self and like self-love and like that discussion happen alongside all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree. I think it's also, I mean, it's so connected to some of those morality questions, right? Because even as you were talking about that, I think one of the big questions, and one of the, if not the big question, is like the question we talk about the most is like Jane leaving. Like, she had to do that for herself. And it would have been, in her mind, morally wrong to stay. And I think in the time period, it would have been impossible for her to argue that morally it was right for her to stay. I think it's complicated. I think in our chapter 27 episode, I said I would stay. I think his arguments won me over. But I think one of the reasons I hear people defending Rochester's actions around Bertha and the choices that he made is because they love him. And he's such a wonderful character, and he does steal your heart. How could you not love Rochester? And the answer is because he's complex. But I think people have this idea that in order to love someone like Rochester, in order to want Rochester and Jane to be together, in order to see them being together as a happy ending, Rochester has to be a good person. And so in order to have a relationship with someone, to have that community, to have some of those other things, you have to be a good person. And I think that is so interesting to me. It's another one where it's like, I think Jane's relationships start with a little bit more black and white, but they start pretty gray, and then they get more black and white for a minute, and then they go back to gray, because we talked for a long time in that first book episode about Bessie and how heartbreaking she is, because she has the ability to be kind to Jane. She sees that Jane needs that, and she only does it sometimes.
I think there's entire psychology and child development studies that can be done about how you can kind of mess up a kid if you don't give them the attention that they need. And so I think that's so interesting that we get glimpses of that, and how much that can, from an early age when we are so impressionable and we are forming how we even communicate with other human beings, we need that love, and that we need people around us to show us how to be. And that she didn't have a lot of that, I think is a very powerful way to introduce our protagonist in a story.
Yeah. And I think it goes on to the Miss Templar relationship and the Helen relationship, and how does Jane choose to spend her time with people when she's at Lowood, and who does she choose to be influenced by? Who does she choose to try to be like? And then I think it defines, like you said, her relationship with society is one of the other things that we talked about in community, and where do you find that community, and who do you find community with, and how does that define who you are, which is so interesting.
I love, there's so many moments, right, where I think because she grew up and had to be able to be independent because of her aloneness, I think that's where we see a lot of that kind of strength in a young woman that may not normally be portrayed in media at the time of her. I think it's so unusual that I assume it was so unusual for Jane to simply advertise for a job. That seems like not a very common thing. Like, you would otherwise typically, I believe, like fall back on your friends or your family or the people that you know to help you find work or go on to your like next position. But Jane didn't have that. So she's like, well, I'm used to being alone. I will do this myself. And she posts this job. And the fact too that I love right away, Rochester clocks in her. He's like, you have the look of someone who, if they need to live alone, they can. And that terrifies him, because he's someone who is incredibly lonely and wants to care for others and wants to be close to other people and have that community. And so I think it scares him. And I think maybe that's partially why he works so hard to try to influence her, because he knows, he's like, you can leave me in a second and I don't want to lose you. And then, yes, once again, of course, the big moment where Jane, her entire life, she's been looking for connection with another human being. And when she finds this man that she loves and who loves her passionately, to then say, for my own self-respect, I must leave you and go off on my own and be alone. Like, that's the other thing about this story, is that like her entire life, all she wanted was people who loved her. And then here's someone who loves her, but he's crossed this line, and she's like, damn it, Rochester, like I have to go now. And this sucks because I want to be here. And it's just, I think the way that these things kind of evoke these emotions, it's so good.
Well, and it's probably my favorite. At least, I don't know if it's my favorite because I only found it when we read the book, or if it's my favorite because it would be my favorite anyway. But there's something that really speaks to me in that same conversation you're talking about, when Jane sort of is asking to herself, who would care for you? Like, who would care for you? Like, if this is, and she has the response that is, we talked about this, I hope something that everyone has, regardless of how much community they have, which is, I care for myself. The first answer to that question, compare little Jane, who has moments of just desperately wanting people to love her, who says to Helen, I need other people. The heart of why she's able to walk away is because she cares for herself. And that comes from a million different places. And becoming a person that it does not matter what other people think. It's one of those things that we say to kids a lot, like, don't worry about what other people think. What other people think doesn't matter. Of course it does. Don't be insane. We live in a world that's a society. Of course, what other people think matters. The real thing is what you think matters more. And caring about and loving yourself first matters, because by the great philosopher RuPaul, if you don't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something there too, of saying the big thing for Rochester is, caring what other people think. Because I think Rochester, we discussed a lot when you were kind of going into how you're like, this is not just Rochester like asking her to stay. This is him explaining his philosophy on life and how he interacts with society. And I think we discussed that we interpreted that a long time ago, ever since kind of the Bertha fiasco, he decided, I hate the rules of this society, and I've decided to say, screw it. I'm going to go and do what I want. So he also has this element of independence. It's different than Jane's, of course, but I think he's got the fact that he is a man and has money and privilege and stuff. So he can kind of throw off certain societal norms and go and have many mistresses. And he's okay to attempt bigamy and all this other stuff. But I think we get an example of that same thing, of someone being like, you know what? No, I decided I don't care what other people think. I'm going to pursue my happiness. And I think Jane also says, I'm going to pursue my happiness, but that's kind of more so in the sense of like, I'm pursuing my self-care, my self-love. And if I pursue this other happiness with you, I would be discarding that. And like you said, that self-love, self-care needs to kind of come first.
Well, and it's we think of self-care and self-love in such a narrow lens right now. Like, we think of it as like somebody taking a cool bath, as opposed to it being like
respecting yourself,
understanding what it is that matters to you and acting off of that.
Yes.
And I think it's so interesting because, as you said that, like, we probably wouldn't, like, Jane and Rochester are two of the main characters who we see taking their own path and living their own way and not being constrained by these societal rules. But I think Helen and Miss Temple are also characters that do that. Like, Miss Temple actively works against things that Brocklehurst wants her to do because she thinks it's right to take care of these children, and she is constantly walking that line. Helen has her own set of religious beliefs. A child in 1847 at a religious institution goes, I know what right is, and I am going to live by that. And I think there's a lot of things that Rochester and these two, Miss Helen and Miss Temple, have that are really, Miss Helen, LOL, have that are really different. But I think that is one thing that, again, is really similar. And how Jane chooses to form relationships with people like that, when you compare it to someone like a St. John, who I hate so much.
Yeah, I feel like just in the way that this part of the discussion is kind of like wrapping up, I feel like another theme you could totally like write a thesis on is simply along the lines of the moral thing. It's like, how do we forge our own paths, right? Yeah. The choices we make and things like that. But
well, we could... genuinely, sincerely and genuinely, we talked about that idea of like all of these things we could talk about in a great deal of depth. And we've talked a little bit about characters already, but I want to look back at some of these themes. And we talked about this a little bit in each of them, but how I keep coming back to that central question of why Jane Eyre, and like, what about these themes makes Jane Eyre stand the test of time? I have a couple of thoughts of my own, but I'm curious as to what, when you look at the themes of the story, what about those do you think has stood for this 175 years and unlimited number of adaptations?
Yeah, I think like, since just focusing on like the feminine strength, the feminine, like the perspective of this character, I think that is something that any reader can pick up either from the day the book was published to the 1970s to today and to 50 years in the future. And I think the relatability of Jane as a perspective character is something that everyone can be like, okay, I didn't have to go to an orphanage essentially, but I have definitely felt excluded in my life. I've had these challenges, and I feel like I also like learned from them, and I, like Jane, I want to kind of be strong like this. And I think everyone has that feeling of being left out and wanting to belong someplace. That I think is a universal concept. I think the romance and mystery will almost always be something that draws people in. Because, you know, we love to, if you view this book not as like a moral discussion and a TED talk that you could build a university around, you could also be like, ooh, it's also a fun, spooky romance. And so you could see it that way. And you don't have to go into this depth. You can literally just pop it on, like me, jump to the Timmy D moments and be like, ooh, but isn't he hot? Like, I feel like that's like, this is a story that you can take from it what you want. And I think that's one thing that's wonderful and will make it go for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's something you and I've talked about when we first started reading the book, is we were both a little bit worried it was going to be one of those like really intense books we read in lit class where you're sort of exhausted by it. And sure, it's beautiful, but it's beautiful in the way that art is beautiful when you need an interpretation of it to understand what the hell they're talking about. And I think that universality of it that you talked about, and the ways that, again, that female strength, I think the defining morality and a discussion of morality within this very appealing story, the relationships and the nuances of relationships within this very appealing story. I was going to say that Shakespeare in some ways is a counter to that Jane Austen in some ways is a counter to that. But actually, both of those authors, like Bronte, were writing for the masses. At the time, that was something that everyone could interpret and understand. And I think that's something that those stories that live on, the stories that keep getting told again and again and again, the way they live and exist is to entertain first. And then they're like, it's that spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. They're sneaking in these like big concepts and these big themes in this creepy story with all of these like tantalizing things around every corner and bend. It's the theme is somehow the extra, and the story is the heart of it, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I've been watching a few video essays recently that kind of talk about how it's easy to pretend you're better than someone who likes pop music or someone who likes melodrama. And I think similar to finding like, well, female strength doesn't always mean that you're like, you know, super strong or whatever. Like, there is value into something that everyone can connect with because it is a universal truth. And these are feelings that across countries and cultures, people can be like, I feel that, like, I can connect with that. And that is very special and powerful. I think anything that brings people together as opposed to, you know, pulling them apart by saying like, oh, well, I like this really obscure artist that no one else understands. It's like, well, that's good for you. I'm happy that makes you happy. But also, like, 5 billion people are in love with this one thing, and that's great. That unites those people. That's really cool.
Yeah, just because something is popular doesn't mean that it loses its value, you crazy stuck-up asshole. Sorry. But I think that we've talked a bit about characters kind of within the themes, obviously, but we're moving into our conversation around characters before we do sort of that wrap-up interpretation discussion. And I think the first thing we have on our list is the idea of generally how she writes characters. And I have an endless number of thoughts, but I'm very curious as to what your initial thoughts on how Bronte writes these characters in Jane Eyre.
Most of what I have to say about that, I feel like I've already accidentally covered. But I think I would just simply say that what we've talked about so much about why we love these characters, even the Brocklehursts and the St. Johns, is because these are, we know people like this. These are real characters. They are complex characters. No one is simply a bad guy. I mean, yes, Brocklehurst can go suck an egg, but like, they're also like, these are people that we know in real life. And I think that comes from, like, I assume Charlotte Bronte writing based on her own experiences and the people that she knows. And so bringing that realism into the story makes it easier for the audience to connect with them and be like, I know that person. I know this person. I wish I was Jane, and I wish I had my own Rochester and all this other stuff. So that's what I have to say about the writing of it.
Yeah, I think I have very similar thoughts on like big picture, looking at the characters. One of the things I talk about a lot is in books that I love and in stories that I love, every character feels three-dimensional. Like, it's one of the things I talk about is the idea of like world building and characters when I'm talking about literature or any sort of story, is like, there are some books and there are some stories where I feel like if I opened a closet, there would be stuff in it. And then other times it feels like a set on a play. And that's not, one is not necessarily better than the other, but Jane Eyre is I could open a closet and there would be, and Bronte knew what stuff was in that closet. The same thing with each of these characters. Like you said, Bronte knew these people, but she also, her ability to understand and capture people and their stories and how they make decisions in a way that we are talking about people 175 years ago. She captured a type of not just a person, not just like a moment, but what makes that person universal? What is like the core thing about human beings that make them behave like Brocklehurst? What is the core thing about human beings? John Reed is barely in this book, and I feel like I know him.
Yeah.
Like, Miss Scatcherd is a character that doesn't make it in most adaptions because why would you possibly sneak Miss Scatcherd in? She is an incredibly real character. Like, Diana is on the page for 15 seconds, and I have friendships like that. And I know the value of friendships like that.
And you know, Lillian, how I think Charlotte Bronte was able to do that is because she must have been an observer. She was someone who did not go into a room assuming she knew everything about everybody. She probably went into a room and watched people and learned about them. And as we've been talking about, as is like so important and strong and wonderful. And so I think that's how she was able to capture that.
Well, and you can just hear her own experience. Like you said, this is an autobiography of Jane Eyre. It's not an autobiography in the way that like technically autobiographies are, but isn't it though? Because it's this woman who sees the world and sees people and sits quietly and then looks at the world and goes, you don't think I have anything going on inside, and there is an entire world in here.
Yeah.
And my internal life is just as complex and just as deep as everyone else's. And then she went and gave every single one of her characters, no matter how long they're on page, a deep internal life. Mrs. Fairfax, who is a character we have talked about, is a sweet, sweet being who just does what she's told and doesn't even question the crazy woman living in the attic. Is a character. She has depth to her. She is a deep character, even though that character lives what could be misinterpreted as a shallow life. She's just somebody who's smiling and going along with it, and she's happy living the life she's living. And that doesn't make her any less real or any less important than a Jane who needs to break free of this construct and go do things. And if she can't have freedom, and if she can't have this excitement, at least have a new type of service. Like that is and these are universal people that still exist in just a different set of circumstances today.
Yeah, which is another, and I know I've said this before, but even if we can't get it with like English subtitles or anything, I'm so excited to see more like foreign films do this because I want to see how different cultures. That's why like Singdil is one of my favorites that we've watched, just because it's so fun to see how other people interpret these universal characters and stories and feelings and themes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we can keep this in if this is what we end up doing, but we may end up cutting it out. The list as it exists now, the next one we're going to watch is probably Italian with no subtitles, because I have not been able to find any other foreign adaptions with English subtitles, or we would have watched some by now. Like this is not me like sneaking them away. It's like we have to make a choice of, are we going to just watch this and trust that we know the story well enough?
Yeah, so can't wait for that. It's going to be awesome. Do we want to dwell more on some character things, or should we kind of start to do like how this is interpreted and how will it continue?
I think, yeah, just really quickly, so when we originally put this together, we had 3 specific characters. I think talking generically about how she writes characters and how she writes people has really covered that, because we ended up talking about these characters so much. But I think the characters of Jane, Rochester, and Bertha, they're so incredible. Like we did a whole episode on Bertha. I cannot do it again because it will be another 2 hours. But who she is, her heartbreak and controversy, I think, is central to this story. Rochester's complexity and the fact that he is both, you can read him as wholly, there's ways to interpret what's on page as wholly evil. There's ways to interpret what's on page as wholly sweet being. And the reality is probably somewhere in between there. Yeah. Jane, we've talked about the whole time, because Jane is Jane Eyre.
I think, Rochester is obviously amazing for all of these reasons. I wrote down in my notes, I was like, bad boy versus sweet bean, because like he's mysterious and seductive, but he's also like so fragile, and it's just there's so many things about him. And I think it's so interesting kind of to maybe lead us towards this discussion of interpretation. I think it's so interesting when you see a version of Jane Eyre that clearly is more focused on Rochester, because the person who read the book or saw the other stuff said Rochester is the interesting part of this story. That's what we're focusing on. And you can really, it's very obvious when they don't focus on Jane. But like that's before, when you were talking about in the moral debate, when people kind of want to say that he's a good man because they're in love with him, I think that's another like such a crucial thing about how well she writes this character, is like he is this kind of bad guy. Like I said, I'm like, oh, it's about a man who commits bigamy, but you're rooting for him. It's like, this is a very complicated character that we want to believe in. And I've had so many fictional like villainous crushes where I'm like, but like, what if I wrote a fanfic that explains all of his bad actions? Because I really, really like him. And so to like be able to give us a character that makes us want to, you know, see these other sides and try to explain everything. Well done, Bronte.
Killed it. I think, well, and I think that's, so all of these things that we've talked about kind of culminate in this idea of what that's the why. That's our answer to it. But it's also, why has it been interpreted over and over and over and over and over again? And I think my answer to that is because so much of it is left open for interpretation. Because she is so often asking a question, and some of the adaptions are also asking that question, and some of the adaptions are answering it.
Yes, I think you're right, Lillian. I think it's something where when people see this story and the questions that are raised there, I think it's one of those things where it's like everybody has their hand in the air. They're like, I know what this means. And they want to share their version of it. I think it's also, like we said, this kind of, it's a story that has this big twist, has a big impact. I think when people, because it's been made so many times, so like the people who made it in the 80s, they maybe saw versions of it that came out like in the 40s or whatever, or like heard it on the radio. So many creators have had this like exposure at some point, and to be able to think to yourself like, I want to remake a classic. Oh, I remember Jane Eyre, that blew me away. I want to do that for like the next generation. And I think maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah. And I think there's also so many, like, it's also that 3-dimensional characters, right? Of like, we talked about this in the Bertha episode. Bertha is on page for 300 words. Like, she's a description of her that's not somebody else talking is 300 words of this 186,000 word book. And that character is pulled out and seen in a book that was written this year, 175 years later. You took Gwendolyn. There we go. Oh my God. I'm like, we're social media friends now. I can't believe it. Gwendolyn. She wrote Reluctant Immortals, and she took B, made this character of B, and had this very different interpretation. I think her interpretation of Rochester is absolutely not how I read him. She made him a horrendous villain. However, there's nothing on page that directly contradicts what she says. He could be a gaslighting nightmare. And Bertha's just actually somebody he has trapped. Like, that's not how I see the story, but I also think what I've loved about the adaptations, what we talk about so often through this process is, I disagree with you, but I also don't think you're wrong in so many of these moments and decisions.
Right. And to also be like, you know, with a book that is hard to adapt because it contains so many themes and things, you know, you get to decide, what am I going to highlight here? Am I doing a Christian-based family radio program, and I think it's great to mostly talk about a man dressing up as a gypsy? That's what I'm going to do with Jane Eyre. And someone else says, you know what? I've got access to the beautiful like Highland moors. We're going to really have a discussion about how Jane tries to like connect with nature in my version. And someone else who's like, you know what? Timmy D signed on and he's a hunk. So everyone step aside. He's going to really just lead this production.
This is just Timmy D delivers Rochester monologues.
Yes. I think one thing that I wrote down that I am very excited to see, because it is honestly unforgivable that Hollywood/BBC has not given us a new movie/TV show since 2011. You guys, you're really falling behind. But when we do get our next version, and the many versions that will come out in Lillian and I's lifetime, I'm so curious to see how this story continues to be adapted for modern audiences. Because one thing that I have noticed is the more modern we get, I think they definitely make certain changes. Because I think there's, at least when it comes to, I think that this story from the beginning has always been like a very feminist story. But I think some people who they look at the source material and certain things and they don't see it that way. And so I think that's what we're most likely going to get, I predict, as this story is adapted to more and more modern audiences, that they're going to make changes that they think are fixing things, but it's actually a matter of like, no, you don't need to like have Jane fit your girl boss cookie cutout. You need to show the strength that she has on the page and just pay attention to that. But that's how I see this changing. Yeah,
I also think it'll be interesting because it's something that we talked about recently when we were talking about the, I can't remember if we talked about this on the podcast or just you and I talked about this. Sometimes Piper and I talk without microphones.
Weird.
I'm sorry, guys. The 73 version, we had one of our listeners, a raccoon, tell us that she thinks that as we get older, we'll see the 73 differently. And it will, as we get older, it'll become something that we can appreciate more. Maybe that's true. We'll know eventually, hopefully. But I also am curious to see how our interpretations of past versions change. Like, do we see, when we watch the 43 right now, it is such a product of its time. When we watch some of the ones in the 90s, they are such a product of their time. The 73, good God, it's the fashion. I cannot express enough times how much that movie is made in 1973. But I think I'm curious to see how I feel about the 2011, 20 years from now. Yeah. How do I feel about the 2006, 20 years from now? I think it's fair to say that no matter how long this podcast goes for, if 30 years from now an adaptation of Jane Eyre comes out, Piper and I will dust off our mics and come talk about it.
Like, for any of you still listening, it's us. We're back again.
It'll be great. You guys will love it. Yeah. So never unsubscribe. I think it's both, what do people want? They're products of their current time. They're products of conversation with each other. And I think part of the reason why they're able to do that is because of how many questions Bronte left for us to answer for ourselves. Because I think that's part of the point of what she's saying, is these are things you should think about. That I'm pointing you to the questions. And I will find out. We're going to do a lot of things this year that I'm very excited about. But I think that she's somebody who is simultaneously confident enough and smart enough to go, these are the questions you should be asking. And yet humble enough and smart enough to go, but I'm not going to say I have the answers forever. But the questions themselves are still always relevant, which is so interesting to me.
Absolutely. So one thing that we didn't do ahead of time was ask you guys what your answer is to this main question that we've posed, which is why Jane Eyre? So I know I, for one, would love it if you could reach out to us either on social, because I'm sure Lillian will have some kind of a post that has this question posed. Give us your answers. Why does this story speak to you throughout the years? Why do you think it will live on? And you can reach out to us at Eyre Buds on all of our social, but you can also send us your own lengthy TED Talk essays answering this question, eyrebuds@gmail.com, because we would love to hear what this means to you and why you think it's so important.
Absolutely. And I think this is just a note on the fact that we're a year into this. You guys, I cannot express how sincerely we love you.
Yes.
Like, it has been such a joy. Piper and I talk all the time about, like, the most pleasant surprise was finding this community of people who cared about this thing and helped us find all the things that we love about Jane Eyre. You guys pointed us to, you guys helped us find, you guys are the ones who encouraged that. What this podcast is now is because of those people who found us in those early months and have stuck with us, and the people who we get messages all the time that they make my heart so full, of people being like, I just binged all of your episodes. And I'm like, what do you mean?
I was actually going to say at the beginning of this too, I think that's a big thing of, like, why Jane Eyre, a big part of it, I think, is the community that has formed around this book. Because, like, yeah, it's fun to, sit by yourself and one friend and be like, we both like this thing. But then, like, for me, from my personal experience, it's like when you go from just you and your friend who like this one thing to, like, going to your first convention, and suddenly there's so many people and they're all like, we all love this thing. And you're like, I found my people. It's so exciting. And so we just love seeing your joys, your, like, criticisms and analyses, and letting us share ours as well. So thank you for welcoming us to this beautiful community.
Yeah. And we are going to keep doing this podcast for the rest of time. As Piper mentioned at the beginning, I signed that contract, and because of that, Piper is also legally obligated to do this for the rest of time.
Yeah.
But this is certainly not the end, although this year might look a scotch different, same basic concept, but we actually have already read the book, which makes it very different to begin with. We're going to keep watching adaptions, but because, as I mentioned, we've watched the ones that are easy to find. We've watched the ones that are in English. We've watched the ones So we're gonna be doing that potentially a little bit differently, but we're gonna also do some of these theme episodes that we've talked about. We have some really exciting stuff that, because we're recording this early, I do not know if we can announce yet when this comes out. So you might know about those things, you might not. Probably we have a Patreon and have a video about that you can go take a look at and learn all the details about what that looks like. But we're going to do rewatches. We're going to do interviews. We're going to talk about these themes. We've talked a few times. One of the big things we're doing differently this year is we're going to look at Bronte, and we're going to figure out what Charlotte was all about and what her kooky little family was up to. Those crazy kids who wrote spooky stories from the moors. So all of that is yet to come this year. And we are so excited to have this ride continue with you guys, our listeners, who we love so very, very much.
100%. So thank you guys so much for joining us. If you feel like leaving a review, that's really helpful as well. 5 stars or whatever you feel is appropriate. But until then, we love you. We'll see you later. Happy Jane Eyre reading and watching, guys.
Bye.
Bye.